I am Myria Georgiou. I'm a professor in media and communications in the department here. In my research, I've always been interested in understanding how people construct a sense of identity and community. So how people try and hopefully find a place in the world, either as individuals or as groups. And I've always been intrigued on the role of the media, how important are media for people, for different individuals in different groups to find that place in the world with others and sometimes against others. So with this big question as a background, my research with audiences has spread across two main areas. The first one relates to migrants and diasporas, so how people who are spread across space, across countries, might use the media in different ways to link with people locally, nationally or transnationally. And the other strand of my research relates to urban citizens. So in many ways, the exact opposite, how people who are concentrated in a single space and who very often find themselves on top of each other and next to others that they might like or might not like, might use the media to negotiate their sense of self, find space, find community, but also to try to keep away who they might consider as strangers. So my most recent project has brought these two different groups together, migrants and urban citizens. I'm working now on a project called the digital making of the city of refuge. So myself and my research team, we're looking at the ways that newcomers and established populations in cities might use digital communication and digital media to try to negotiate their distance or proximity from each other, try to understand each other, and sometimes try to keep away from each other. Among the many different theories on audiences that I have used and have influenced me, the theory that I found most influential and most relevant and more thought-provoking for me is that of the circuit of culture. So the theory of the circuit of culture was developed by British cultural studies in the late 1990s, especially with the leadership of Stuart Hall. And to me, that's a fundamental theory to understanding media and communications in their totality and in their complexity, but also in the many different ways that media influence the way that we understand the world and the way that we live our lives. So very briefly, what the circuit of culture says is that any culture, media culture more specifically for us, is constituted through 5 different moments, what they call moments. These include production, consumption, representation, regulation, and identity. So what is important with this theorization that British cultural studies offer is that instead of thinking of media as a linear process where power is concentrated either on production and representation, and this power trickles down towards audiences and subordinates people's identities to the power of the media and institutions and so on, what British cultural studies say to us is that we have to think of media culture in its totality. So that means that audiences and studying audiences and understanding audiences at some points are much more important than focusing on media industries or in media production. So for example, if we think about how certain forms of masculinity are constructed around video games, we can think about how many young men do not only relate to the game they play on the screen, but they also relate to other young men who are also playing the game. And in many ways, they construct a sense of commonality, a shared identity with these other people. So identity and consumption, in this case, is crucial to understanding the influence of video games in many contemporary societies. Or if we think of another example of how, when there is the World Cup, many people gather together in a pub to watch their national team compete. These people come together in that environment not only to watch the game, because they can watch the game at home, they can watch the game on their own, but they come together in that shared space which becomes a microcosm, if you like, a microcosm of an imagined community of the nation, to construct and reinforce a sense of belonging to a national community. So if we think, to go back to that theory of the circuit of culture, if we think about media as a system that involves different processes and different actors, we will be able to understand more clearly different phenomena, especially those relating to identity, construction of communities and citizenship, rather than thinking of other theorizations of audiences, perhaps, that might isolate the audiences, or perhaps other theories of media and communications that undermine cultural questions. This is the question that has been occupying so many scholars in media and communications over decades, and it's a debate that will not go away. In many ways, I think in order to find the answer, we have to start by thinking of how we understand humans. How do we understand humanity and our potentials and also our limitations? So do we believe that humans make decisions and reflect on what they decide to do or not? If we accept that we all have the ability to make decisions, at least informed to a certain extent, then we might accept that media audiences are active audiences, are media savvy, because we always choose. We always choose to a certain extent what we watch, what we post, who we engage with. At the same time, our understanding of our choices and our potential to make choices does not usually imply that we're all free-floating individuals. As individuals, we might be constrained by what our teachers say or what our parents say, how much money we have to spend on buying a technology, for example, how much time we have to use to balance between writing an essay and watching our favorite series and so on. So we're never free-floating. We're never fully free to make decisions as media audiences. So I think to the question, to come back to the original question, are audiences media savvy or easily influenced? The answer is always contextual, and the answer in many ways is always somewhere between. We do always have constraints, we have conditions we're subject to, but also we always have agency and reflexive understanding of the world. Very often, and actually throughout the history of media and communications, when the new comes in, out goes the old. And especially in the first days of the rise of digital communication, many scholars became fascinated with everything that is different, everything that has died and has been replaced by something new. And audiences have been one of those elements of media and communication that have been considered as being dead, as being an outdated category. But change does not necessarily mean the death of audiences. Of course, there are changes that are important, and they're behind this critique, and we should always be critical of the concepts and the ideas that we have. Changes in media and communications, especially with interactive media, especially with user-generated content, that makes us question the value of the media. But then I think there are also three important continuities that matter here, and why audience is still an important category, and in many ways more important than ever in trying to understand media and communications. So I think the first point that we should make in relation to the continuing relevance of the audience is that of what audience actually does, or digital users actually do. So digital users, like audiences have always done, what they do is that they engage with discourses and they engage with technologies, communication technologies, in trying to make sense of the world. So this has always been the case with audiences. The fact that people did it differently does not mean that digital users are not as much users of discourses and technologies as they have always been. The second issue that we have to remind ourselves before we get fascinated with the new is that old media are not dead. So television is the most obvious example. Television was on the decline for a while, but now television is on the rise. And television in many ways is more popular than it has been for many, many decades. So many of us do binge watching, and so many of us engage in conversations with other people, with our friends online, friends on face-to-face conversations about what we watch on TV. And this has been something that we have been doing for a long time, and audience researchers have discussed for a very long time. And the third point that we have to remember, that takes us also back to the circuit of culture, is how media users, digital users, are not free-floating individuals. When we use the Facebook in the same way as when we watch TV, we engage with content and technologies within systems. And Facebook, for example, is as much of an institution as the BBC, as New York Times, and the political economy and the conditions that are created within different systems go beyond what we do as individuals. So there is always a context, there are always restrictions, there are always relations of power that define how digital users use the media, what is the level of their freedom, and what choices they make that might be informed, might be very often very individually defined, but never free-floating. I have used different methods in my studies and my research, and I have been primarily a qualitative researcher. I have to say that I have a weak spot for ethnographic methods, participant observation especially. And we know that ethnographic methods are very often the most demanding on our time, the most demanding on our commitment to the field and to the subject that we study. But why do I think that we have to do it whenever we come and to the level that we can? When we think about media consumption, we think about the ways that people make sense of the world through the media. Most often people do not think about why they use the media, how they try to find a place in the world, who they are, or why they like what they like and why they don't like what they like. Because media are ordinary. Media use is ordinary. It's ordinary and banal. It's something that we do without thinking about it. So we can ask audiences what they think about what they watch, and this is a valuable method to get information and again to get an understanding of patterns and informed choices. But we do also need to understand what people might not be able to articulate because they are not thinking about media in this rational way all the time. Big data. With the rise of big data and our ability to do research with big data, many of us have become fascinated by the enormous possibilities of getting to know things, at a scale that we never knew before. So we now can understand how YouTubers become successful across boundaries, what millions of people across boundaries choose to watch on YouTube. We know so much more about what audiences and media users across the world do. So this possibility of collecting big data is invaluable, and we can get knowledge and we can use it in our analysis and research. However, what big data gives us, which is how many people do what, the patterns in terms of media use, do not explain why and how they do things. So the big challenge for me for audience research is to continue to engage with the human. So it is the people who form media users, it is the people who form audiences, and this is what we should continue doing through our research, talking to people, observing people, trying to understand how they use media and for what purpose, to connect with others, to disconnect with others, to find love, to find their place in the world, and these questions cannot be answered through big data.